Okay, so welcome everyone to the final American Physical Society Climate Physics Seminar being put on by the Topical Group for the Physics of Climate. Just a couple words before I get going. Our speaker today is Annalisa Bracco, who I'll introduce more in a second. A couple words before I get going. During the talk, Annalisa will give the talk. Feel free to put questions into the chat. I will look at those questions, but I will read them out at the end of the talk unless it's a point of clarification that should be made right then and there. At the end of the talk, in addition to that, please feel free to raise your hand using the hand raising tool, and we'll call on you. We definitely encourage questions, particularly from students and postdocs. So come armed with what you want to know. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce Annalisa Bracco from the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and where she has just moved, and Georgia Tech, where she has been was a faculty as well as associate chair. She got her PhD at the University of Genoa in 2000, was a postdoc at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and is a recipient of the American Meteorological Society Pfaffenhof Award in 2011. She's done wide range of work in physical oceanography and ocean circulation, from large-scale ocean circulation down to the submesoscales, both on the large-scale ocean transport as well as impacts on biology. And today she's going to talk to us about multiscale physics and climate solutions in the case of ocean alkalinity enhancement. And so without further ado, I will let her take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and very happy to be here. I'm going to talk about something relatively new in the kind of topics that I've covered through my research career, which have already been many, I admit. But I got interested into the climate solution part or topic overall. And I've been lucky enough, because this was a little bit earlier than this year, to be funded to look at some of the potential climate solutions that have been proposed on the ocean side. We received funding through the Earthshots program from DOE. Previously from NOAA and also from the Tides Foundation, and this is pretty much what funded the work that I'm going to show you. And what I'm going to show you, which really is spanning different projects, would have not been possible without the incredible work of two postdocs in my group, Xing Zhou, who is still at Georgia Tech, and Yuba Novi, who moved to NOC last year, and without the collaboration with Takahito and Chris Reinhardt, who really helped a lot. And you will see pretty much most of the equations that I'm going to show you are coming from Taka on this topic. I've been interested for a very long time in multiscale interactions. And this is a figure we put together for a paper in 2018 that kind of summarize those kind of interactions of from the micro scale all the way to the planetary scale that we have in the ocean and in the atmospheres, and how those are coupled. And of course, those are not the only one that we have in the climate system. Those are the ones that we portray here to stick to just ocean and atmosphere. Land, ice, the cryosphere are just adding complexity and adding interactions as well. Today, I'm going to really focus around how the ocean works mostly, and really looking at what here is indicated as ocean 2, so the submesoscales all the way into the planetary scale, with the point of view of looking at potential climate solutions or potential remedies that have been proposed to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere looking at the ocean side of things. If you're not familiar with what climate negative emission technologies or carbon dioxide removal technologies are, it has been essentially assessed that in order to keep the climate from warming less than 2 degrees Celsius, we need not just to move to green energy sources, something that at this point, at least in the US, we're not planning to do, by the way, but also remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we continue with business as usual, we're just going to go over the 2 degrees Celsius warming. If we want to get at the end of the century with less than 2 degrees and essentially a net zero emission, we need not only to strongly move into green energy solutions, so essentially produce energy through solar, winds, nuclear, but also remove some of the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere. There are many ways to do that. Many ways have been proposed. Some make sense, some, I have to admit, not so much. I'm going to focus on two that are related to the ocean in this talk. This is simply because my background is in physics, but I apply that, first of all, to oceanography, and so I'm going to look at what the ocean can do, not because I'm saying we should use the ocean for carbon uptake. I think that there are also other ways, like direct air capture, for example, which is completely engineered, may work better. But just because there is a lot of work that is being done and a lot of funding that is being shoveled towards those potential solutions on the ocean side. And I think that there is a lot where not understanding the physics of the system is making any kind of prediction quite unreliable. When we're looking at the ocean from the carbon uptake perspective, we have to consider dynamics that go on in the mixed layer. We have to consider also that the ocean takes CO2 from the atmosphere, uptakes CO2 from the atmosphere through solubility and also through the biological cycle. So we have two ways. One is simply solubility, so CO2 in areas where the water is cold enough is just going to be uptaken naturally. And there is going to be a gas exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. So whenever there is upwelling, you're going to have outgassing. And whenever you can instead take it in regions where you don't have strong upwelling, you're going to usually have a sink in the ocean. You have a very large sink whenever you're doing deep convection. And then you have the biological cycle, and therefore you are essentially doing what plants do to plankton, and you're using some of that CO2 in the atmosphere for primary production, and then you are emitting potentially CO2 back in the system whenever you have respiration going on near the surface or anywhere in the mixed layer, so that things can be mixed easily back into the atmosphere. A little bit more of a full picture of what the carbon cycle in the ocean, and especially the removal of CO2, looks like, is given by this plot that was plotted by the National Academy of Science in a report that they published in 2022, which was specific about ocean-based carbon dioxide removal potential. And what you really want to do if you want to increase the carbon dioxide removal is to accelerate how CO2 is taken from the atmosphere and put into the ocean, and then how that CO2 is converted in something that can sink fast. Because if you can sink particles of carbon all the way to the bottom, you're going to have bacteria or that are going to use it, and that's totally fine, or you're going to bury it pretty deep and you're going to have a very long-term storage of that carbon into the sediments. Of course, in trying to do that, you have to consider everything that goes on in the ocean in terms of in the upper euphotic layer, so where you have light of photosynthesis, of the fact that there is grazing, and so there is zooplankton that is going to eat that phytoplankton, and there is going to be excretion from, and so detritus that is going to be generated, and that will contain carbon and can potentially fall down. You're going to consider the fact that you're going to have particles sinking through formation of aggregates. And then in the deep ocean, you're going to have respiration, you're going to have consumption, but also decomposition. And so you're releasing some carbon. And that organic carbon potentially can go all the way to the bottom, where it's going to be essentially kept there unless it gets close to upwelling areas where it can be brought up in contact with the atmosphere and eventually release again. So it's a very complicated system. It's a system that we don't model very well, and it's a system that definitely we don't understand extremely well either. Several carbon dioxide removal approaches have been proposed. This is something that NOAA put together to kind of summarize the ones that have been explored the most. Typical one is ocean fertilization. I will not go into that one because I think it makes absolutely no sense. There are a lot of side effects to any kind of ocean fertilization that you want to do. And the other problem of ocean fertilization is that it's very expensive. You have to essentially get fertilizers into the ocean. Producing fertilizers use energy, so you will still need to burn something in order to get that energy out. And then you need to bring it in the middle of the oceans, where again, you have to use a vessel of some kind, and that's also use energy. So usually when you do a life cycle assessment of that, it's simply out of the question. You can cultivate algae. This has been proposed, has been also looked at a long-term solution for coastal areas. The problem of cultivating algae is that you really need to cultivate a lot of algae in order to make a difference. And then you can eventually sink them. There is direct ocean capture. What essentially means is that you're going to extract the carbon from the ocean and then you're going to sink it or store it somewhere. Pretty expensive because moving water is much more energy consuming than moving air. So at the end of the game, when you do the calculation of how much it's going to cost you from an energy perspective, you will see that it's going to cost you less if you do it in the atmosphere. Artificial upwelling and unwelling, again, not particularly satisfying. Ocean alkalinity enhancement is the one where I'm going to focus today, and I will describe a little bit more in detail next. And that's where there seemed to be quite a bit of potential and therefore quite a bit of interest. This is a different graph that is kind of summarizing everything that you can do to improve storage of carbon in the ocean, from artificial upwelling and unwelling, ecosystem recovery, fertilization, blue carbon conservation. Those are the blue carbon conservation and ecosystem recovery are the easy one. You're just essentially, it's the same idea of planting more trees, essentially. Macroalgae culture, ocean alkalinity enhancement. This is really where we will focus today. You can also do direct water capture or direct air capture, which are completely engineered systems. And again, the direct air capture, at least as of today, it's cost much less than the water one. In terms of storage and durability, though, I mean, what you want to do is to take this carbon, do all this work, and then store it somewhere. And you want to make sure that it doesn't go back in the atmosphere. The one that offers the largest amount, the longest durability is really macroalgae algal culture if you can sink all those macroalgae or if you can use them for something and remove them from the system, and then the alkalinity enhancement. And so those two are the ones that I'm going to look at. And the macroalgae ones is really more for a kind of a fun project and really a question that came up from something that is happening in nature. The ocean alkalinity enhancement is part of a larger project where we're really trying to explore some of the limitations of trying to verify exactly how much it can help. In terms of algae, the idea is, as I mentioned, the one of cultivating algae somewhere in the ocean, and then you can harvest them and do something with them, or you can simply sink them in deep water, in waters that are deep enough that you will just store the carbon down there, the carbon that they have sequestered by growing. Of course, you will have to do a calculation of how much algae you need, and you will find out that you really need a lot. And of course, if you're starting to have just cultivations of algae all over the coast of California or the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, sorry, or the whole Mediterranean Sea, you are going not to be able to use that coastline for much else. So this is the first problem. But the interesting one is also that it brings a lot of physics into the game, because you also have to consider how you're going to change turbulence by having all those algae cultivations, and how that is going to impact the circulation and the recycling of nutrients and so nitrogen, phosphorus in the area. And eventually what is going to happen whenever you have too much seaweed that is going to sink at the bottom, potentially causing hypoxia. There are a couple of large projects also funded by potentially from DoD, anyway, in California, looking at this all the way. And it's really a beautiful multi-scale problem, because you really have to look at turbulence to the centimeter scale, and then scale up the problem all the way to how big it needs to be the cultivation of my algae to actually make a dent to the problem, and all the way to what I do with it when I sink it. In this regard, I've done some work that relates to a natural analog, which is really it's the only natural analog that we have for a marine carbon dioxide removal technology, or natural solution, which is the sargassum bloom in the tropical Atlantic. What you see here in the upper right, it's a map of the Sargassum Sea of the North Atlantic. We've highlighted the Sargassum Sea, which is where sargassum, so this algae, which is a floating algae, has been found traditionally, has been observed. We know it's been there since the time of Columbus, but has never really reached too much the coastline, has never bothered anybody too much, has always been there, as far as we know. In 2011, there was a very peculiar winter, and actually in 2010, I'm sorry, there was a very peculiar winter that brought some of the sargassum further down along the coast of Mauritania and along the coast of Africa. Starting in 2011, we began to see sargassum blooming further south at about 10 south, in what you can see in that map is called the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. That sargassum has been growing and growing and growing since. It can be seen through satellites. Is causing a huge amount of problems, because it costs of the order of $300 million per year to clean up the sargassum that ends up on beaches in the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico, especially along the coast of Florida. the carbon fixation that sargassum is doing, so that completely new area covered in sargassum is doing, is estimated to be, since 2018, above 2 million tons per year. Now, the largest plant that we have for carbon capture, which is in Iceland, and it's called Orca, can pull about 4,000 tons of carbon per year. So you just do the math, okay? And I mean, the Orca facility is being, there are now other facilities that are at least as large, and there is the potential of building much bigger ones, but nonetheless, they are extremely expensive, and carbon sequestration to direct air capture, it remains very expensive. This is done by the system itself. Too bad that when all this sargassum reach the coastline, or anyway dies and decay, and it has a very strong seasonal cycle, it releases back the carbon to methane and to the atmosphere. And so the net, unless you take this thing out of the water and you do something with it, it's essentially zero. What I'm showing on the left are satellite images, MODIS mostly, and some rather base images of sargassum in greater detail, which are really showing you how filamentary this distribution is. So what we see is, we can see it also in low resolution satellite images, is a huge concentration of this algae, this floating algae, but in reality, it's extremely dynamic. And it's dynamic because of the circulation and because of the presence of some mesoscale convergence and divergence near the ocean surface. So essentially, it tends to aggregate in fronts. There is also Langmuir circulation. It's essentially affected by the turbulence of the ocean all the way to the scales of few meters. Those are two images. I'm not sure how well you can see the one on the left, but that's taken from an airplane, and you can actually see all the stripes of sargassum in that one. And then you can see one of those stripes in the other photo that shows it a little bit better. And this is essentially how it presents in the field. This is near the US Virgin Islands, the islands of Santoras. The carbon to phosphorus ratio is of the order of between 500 and 1,000 to 1. And the carbon to nitrogen ratio is of the order of 20 to 40 to 1. So sargassum, really just a sargassum, is extremely efficient, much more than typical red fill ratio, so much more than any other phytoplankton that you can have, at drawing down carbon. The problem, again, is that if you let this thing die, it's going to release everything to the atmosphere. So, or even if you collect it and burn it, you are essentially going to release that carbon. So we have to do something about it. And this is just a video of what we observed just outside. They're extremely long, they're kilometer long. Again, outside St. Thomas. So why they are distributed like that? Well, they are distributed like that because we have some mesoscale advection at the ocean surface, and the convergence patterns that submesoscale circulation generate is especially strong near the surface. This is simply because if you take a continuity equation, the lateral convergence depends on the derivative in the vertical, in z, of your vertical velocity. And when you are close to the surface, you have the maximum of that derivative, because at the surface per se, your vertical velocity is essentially zero, and immediately below the surface is large because you have the impact of the wind. So you generate this kind of fronts, and you tend to have patterns that organize whatever stays at the ocean surface and whatever can float at the ocean surface in filaments and withdrawals and things like that, which is exactly what we see in the sargassum and what we've been seeing essentially since about 2006, but not at those not in not in that area, and especially not at the level of what we've been seeing. There are several solutions that have been proposed in order to actually use the sargassum to remove carbon. One is to collect it to at least near the coast and then sink it. Pretty easy. If you can build a system that works almost autonomously and that can work with solar energy, so it can be solar powered, you are essentially, it's going to be a win-win situation. Other usage that have been proposed, the one on the left here is to make bricks. And this has been a complete family business in Mexico. It's very interesting. They figured out that they can use sargassum to make bricks, which are actually extremely resistant and do really well in tropical storms and hurricanes. The other solutions that we are exploring now at Georgia Tech with colleagues, Materials Group, is to use it for biofuel because, the seaweed is mostly made of water, has a huge amount of carbon. You can essentially make biogas and then you can potentially use it to fuel jets. There are issues though, and that the carbon bonds in essentially cellulose inside the sargassum, so they are very energetically hard to break. And so you really need to figure out a way to do it efficiently without spending too much energy just to break that. But this is for me at least, the most interesting part, because my question when I've entered this problem was, well, why in heaven this thing is growing and has gone that high? And so what we build is a model, a mathematical regression nonlinear model that essentially explain with a good approximation what is going on and what has caused this growth of sargassum, assuming that there was some form of seeding in 2011. So what you see here are the observation, which is essentially the sargassum concentration in tons, million tons, in black, and in green is the prediction, or at least what our model can explain. The correlation between the time series is pretty high, and we don't assume, we use anomalies in building the whole system, and so we have deseasonalized everything. So essentially, what comes out from our model does not know about the seasonal cycle a priori. And so what we are using here, what we have seen after doing a lot of analysis is that, first of all, the mixed layer depth in the area where the sargassum is growing got deeper. And this seems to be a climate change signal. And so that deepening has brought more nutrients in the mixed layer and has allowed the sargassum to start growing. The other thing is that the area where it's growing is very strongly stratified. So there is a very strong density gradient between the base of the mixed layer and everything below, which means that when the sargassum is growing, and the sargassum grows in a very peculiar way because it grows near the top and essentially, it's a long vertical string, and near the bottom, it's kind of dying all the time. And when it does that, it releases quite a bit of nitrogen and phosphorus. So on top of that is also hosting a huge amount of shrimp nurseries. So essentially krill nurseries and small crabs. And what all of that does is essentially collecting a very large amount of food for bigger fish to come and feed. So when you start having sargassum, what you do is that you create a whole ecosystem of stuff that then come. And if you look, we have taken a bunch of records with cameras, and you can really see there is a constant coming and going of larger fish that come and eat and feed under the sargassum because they know that they can find food. But in doing that, they're also peeing in the water, and so they are releasing further nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, and so but nitrogen. And so overall, you also have a self-seeding component, and then you also have a dilution component associated with the mix layer, because that self-seeding, it's bigger if the mix layer is shallow, and it gets diluted more if the mix layer is deep. And so we are considering that, and we essentially can explain most of this curve. We also consider that there has been an increase, because there has been an increase in winds, strengthening in the wind field, and that's why the mix layer has been deepening. We've also been looking at an increase in dust, so micronutrients coming from the Sahara. It does make a little difference, not much. And then we also consider the fact that the temperature have gone up a little bit. They really don't seem to make any difference at all. So this is actually, here there is a mistake without the SST 080, not 082, but so we have used this system to kind of explain, we use it to kind of explain what is going on in the Sargassum Sea. And those are just maps that are showing you how much the mix layer has increased. That's a percentage increase, so it's about 20% deeper, especially in winter, and what has been going on with the winds. So this has been interesting, because what also this is telling you is that if this trend continues, and we do expect that at least the trend in the winds is going to be something typical of the climate change that we expect to happen, then we can expect the sargassum to essentially continue growing, or at least keeping up with what is being produced today, which of course gives a much better idea of the kind of investment that we should put forward, because it's not anymore a problem that we can say, you know, it came in 2011, maybe in 2026 will go away. This is, if we have an explanation for why it's there, we can actually say, you can expect that you're going to see this much further along in time, and therefore we should invest towards solutions that are going to use it, instead of just collecting it and spending $300 million every year. So this was fun, and this was funded by the Tides Foundation, which is essentially Google. It also giving you an idea of the kind of scale that you need to really make a dent. In other words, if you really want to use the seaweeds and grow seaweeds for carbon reduction, you have to essentially get to those numbers, and you essentially have to get to this kind of growth every year, which it's probably not something that you want to go everywhere. You want to do everywhere. In terms of our ocean alkalinity enhancement, instead, this consists in adding essentially powder rock to the water, and accelerating in this way, the conversion of carbon dioxide in seawater into bicarbonate. Bicarbonate then is going to sink, and you can essentially have a long-term storage. So the basic chemistry that goes on, it's shown there. So you have an exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and the ocean at the surface. The CO2 with H2O is going to give you, in part, some bicarbonate, and then you can actually accelerate that and have more bicarbonate form if you can add something that helps that. At the same time, when you're doing alkalinity enhancement, you're also going to modify reduce the acidity of the water, and therefore you're going to solve, or anyway correct for the acidification problem that we're having. In all of this, there is a problem of cost. Risk associated with mining, because you need to get all this rock, potential for biodiversity loss, both over land and over the ocean, and also the potential for really increasing the ocean metal content. Nonetheless, this is because it's so easy in principle and is something that is really relatively cheap, or that at least compared with direct air capture, it's one where there is a lot of funding and where there is a lot of experiment and try to figure it out how much we can do with this kind of solution. This is just an example of the reaction that you get, and one thing to note here, and
Okay, I
again,
just need confirmation of
sorry. One thing to note here is that in general, when we are trying to use models to explore this, we tend to essentially just use the basic equation that I showed you earlier and do an acceleration of that. In reality, the equations that you see do change depending on what you use to increase alkalinity. So those are just examples using limestone, anorite, forsterite, lime, periclase. And so there are problems with the physics, as I will show you, but there are also problems with the chemistry. Nonetheless, all of those get to a bicarbonate and production of bicarbonate, which is then stable for about 10,000 years. The first thing to notice is that not everything works the same way. And this is the first big problem. This is a work that was shown through models by Faraki et al. In 2023. And with experiments in the Pacific that support what the model said by Guo et al. Came out earlier this year. One important thing to notice here is that the model that has been used to do this and to do the chemistry correctly has essentially a resolution of about 300 kilometers and is essentially a column model. So not a lot of exchange between different grid cells except that in the vertical. What you see here is the end of the century. So those are experiments around until the end of until 2100. And what is plotted is the surface ocean aragonite saturation states, and you want that to be different from control and going to a much larger value of aragonite. What you see here is that CaO or calcium oxide or manganese oxide work well. Olivine and basalt do not. Again, as I said, this has been supported by trials in the Equatorial Pacific. For calcium oxide, they used steel slag, which showed to have moderate efficiency and also cause only moderate changes to the phytoplankton community and essentially worked as a fertilizer. The second one has not been tried. The problem with manganese oxide is the very high energy cost to produce it. So the first two need to essentially be produced. You're not just going to mine them. And the bottom two are the ones that you mine are very cheap. Well, they don't work. The basalt is going to cause strong perturbation to the ecosystem. This has just been shown through models. The olivine is going to show essentially no changes in the aragonite as much as the basalt, and so it's really not going to be helpful. And on top of that, is going to has been shown to also change phytoplankton types, and so you're really affecting negatively phytoplankton, many kinds of phytoplankton. So this is the kind of work that you can do with models. Another one that you can do is you don't go into the future, you increase the resolution, you do the physics a little bit better. This is using echo, so it's essentially doing it. This work by he and Tika in 2023 is using echo, the ocean estimate. It's doing much better in terms of currents, but you can do it only for the past conditions. You cannot go really into climate scenarios. There is no predictive capabilities. And what this work specifically was showing is that, as you can imagine, you may do relatively well with alkalinity enhancement along coastlines because you have to also deploy all this dust, rock dust. And so if it's close to the coast, it's cheaper. You're going to do relatively well in areas that don't have significant downwelling, because in order for the chemistry to actually happen, you will need about 10 days of the dust that you put in. to be potentially in contact with the atmosphere. So not a big surprise there, but at the same time, this is kind of showing you the limitation of what you can do when you're modeling. So we need to monitor, report, and verify what we can do with these kind of modifications. And the difficult part is really to avoid bottleneck at scale, because both in terms of time and in terms of space, it's very, very difficult to work to cover both. This is a recent work that came out last winter by Seaworthy, where they essentially developed a system that divided the ocean in all those little areas, more or less, with comparable dynamics within the area. And then in each of these areas, they put a perturbation in alkalinity, and they let it go for 15 years. And then they put all these data together, all those simulations together. They use a model with a resolution about 100 kilometers. And they came up with an efficiency map, which is what is shown here. And the color range is between 0 and 1. And that is essentially the amount of carbon uptake in moles divided by the number of moles of alkalinity that has been added. This is not taking care of the details of the chemistry. So it's essentially just doing any kind of alkalinity enhancement. So, you still have to figure out the cost. And what you can see right away, anyway, is that where you do really well seems to be the Southern Ocean. Not exactly cheap to go there and distribute aragonite or alkalinity, or anyway, some of the high latitudes. So you actually do relatively well between Oregon and Alaska and the North Pacific. You don't do well at all whenever you have deep convection, obviously, because you're just taking everything out too quickly. You don't do that well in coastal areas either. But nonetheless, this was a nice, it's a nice tool. You can go online, you can decide where you want to put it, you can get an efficiency. Now, the questions I have is, well, this is a model 100 kilometer resolution. What is actually missing? It doesn't even have eddies. So what I'm showing you here is an exercise where we went from just using a passive scalar all the way to a sophisticated model for alkalinity enhancement, doing all the chemistry. And we're doing that at 2 resolutions with a model in the Gulf of Mexico, 5 kilometer and 1 kilometer. And we are assuming that the alkalinity perturbation is coming through the Mississippi River. So at the Mississippi River limit. So what you see here is if you just have a passive tracer, that passive tracer is going to look quite different, even between 5 and 1 kilometer. So let alone 100, because your turbulence is going to be significantly different. And what you see on the right is the vertical distribution of that tracer. And the vertical distribution is going to be much greater in the 1 kilometer case, because the vertical velocity associated with some mesoscale structures are pretty strong. And so you're going to sink much more and much faster than you would do with another model. So this is a problem, because if I want to calculate the efficiency, I can already see just from this plot that I'm likely to get a higher efficiency at 5 kilometer that I'm getting if I'm doing 1. So if I want to use a model like this one, that's going to be a little bit problematic. Just to give you, this is actually an older work that we have done, calculating also carbon fluxes to really show that in reality, this kind of circulations really matter. Those are particulate organic carbon fluxes recorded in 2 locations. The Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico calls thing in a very weird way because it depends on the lease areas. So one is GC600 and the other is AT357. Those are in the map on the left. And there were, for several years, sediment traps. And this is just 1 year of the record that they recorded. And what you can see is that two sediment traps deployed at about 40-kilometer distance have recorded at times almost the same amount of carbon, at times completely different amount of carbons. And this is just a setup of the sediment trap that we had in place at those two locations. And what we found out is that really what it matters was the presence of those filaments and submesoscale circulation that really move things very differently, even if they are starting from the same place. And what is shown here are essentially we backtrack particles from the ocean bottom all the way to the surface, knowing where and when they were collected in the trap. And so we took those two intervals, so April and October in 2012, September, October, and April, May in 2012, and we backtrack and look at where that particular organic carbon could have come from. And what we found is that it was coming from more or less the same place in April, but it was coming from very different place in September. And so all of that needs to be considered when you're doing alkalinity enhancement. The other important thing of this work is also that if you just assume that your things are going down, those are a particular organic carbon, you can assume that it has a weight, and so it's going down with velocity and speed. And you can assume that it's been shown that that speed varies between 30 meters per day to 100 meters per day about. So we did experiments with different speeds, sinking speeds. And no matter what, when you include the dynamics and the turbulence of the ocean, things go down much faster than if they were just going down in a straight line. So what you see on the left is the amount of days that would have taken to get to the bottom, and so to get to the trap if they had just fallen from the top of the trap to the bottom. And what you see in the distribution is actually what we found through this modeling exercise for both traps. And so that is actually true at both locations. And that really also skews a lot what you're going to get with your models. This is just another way to see something like that. This is the vertical diffusivity calculated for the surface on the left and 20-meter depth. Actually 20 meters below the mix layer depth on the right for simulations calculated using simulations of 1 kilometer and a 5 kilometer resolutions, again for the Gulf of Mexico. And again, there is a significant, pretty much almost an order of magnitude difference just between those runs. So when you're looking at CO2 fluxes, you're also going to see significant differences across most of the seasons. And that's going to continue when you're doing alkalinity modifications. And so when we actually look at what the efficiency is, in our case, well, it's really low. We are finding an efficiency for a release of a 10% increase in alkalinity for a month. We find an efficiency of only about 0.15 in the 1 kilometer run and about 0.25 in the 5 kilometer run. And what really determines the difference in that is the physics, which again it's part of the interesting part. It's not how we are modeling the alkalinity exchanges, is not how we're modeling the biological pump, which we're probably not doing right, by the way, but it's really just the fact that the level of turbulence in those two systems is different. And all the calculations of all the terms that are determining the LC CO2 fluxes come from a work that Taka, Ito, and Chris Reiner published this year. And essentially it's calculating, it's able to divide, to look at each of the contribution to the CO2 fluxes in terms of physics, biology, temperature, and also what the atmosphere is doing. And this is just to show that the alkalinity is also distributed differently. This is through the year. It's an off-molar diagram that is looking at the latitude distribution of the alkalinity in the control runs and in the modified runs at the two resolution. What you can see is that essentially the sub-mesoscale are able to bring filaments that get much further south. And those are filaments of both fresh water and the alkalinity modified waters. And this is the final slide in terms of figures that I have. And what you can see is comparing what of each of those terms that we saw before are doing in the alkalinity modified run versus the control, and then just calculating how much is the resolution effect, which is really just the physics. Okay, so this is just the level of turbulence, and those are the red lines, and you can see the two vertical mixing and horizontal advection red lines really showing up very strongly. So essentially, everything at this level of modeling remains controlled by the physics. It's a really strongly because we're looking at 1 year, but in reality, the possible effect will continue for over a decade. So it's a very strongly multi-scale system, which is extremely difficult to pinpoint. And so removing carbon from the atmosphere, it's a multi-scale problem. And the missing physics remains potentially more important than the actual perturbation that we are simulating in those models. And so the scales associated with the problem, both in time and in space, are just really large. And unfortunately, the small scales matter. So we're just complicating more our life, which doesn't mean we should not attempt to do it. But it's definitely we are still in a large uncertainty kind of situation, and so we have to think about that before starting very large experiments that could really not be as effective as we wish. And with that, I just want to thank everybody and take any question.
Thank you, Annalisa. So I have I'll start with a couple questions on chat. Again, the first is from Shanice Bailey. Has anyone looked at the approach of combining the artificial upwelling and carbon removal in the air in terms of the energy that's required for the tandem system?
So when it comes to artificial upwelling, essentially any kind of life cycle assessment that I've seen, so any kind of assessment that have looked at the amount of energy that is needed to get the instrument to work, has shown that it's absolutely not feasible. You are going to need too much energy for too little. And because what comes up then goes down and vice versa, you also don't tend to have a long storage with that. So I would say that of all the ocean solutions, the upwelling, the artificial upwelling, downwelling are the ones that are getting the least attention at this point.
Thanks. The next is from Brad Marston. How finely do silicate materials need to be ground to ensure that they dissolve, releasing alkalinity before sinking? Should they be dispersed only in regions with upwelling to counteract sinking?
So it's definitely possible to think of just using, honestly, what you want. It's a region that is highly stratified and pretty calm. That helps. Because what you need is that to stay relatively, near the surface in the upper 10 meters for about 10 days. If you have upwelling, you also tend to have quite a bit of mixing. So, I mean, we can look at the areas. I mean, sure, it works, but you have to also consider the small scales probably a little bit more, and you're probably going to be more energetic. In terms of how fine it needs to be grained, it's finer than the sand you would find on the beach, but not much more than that. But that's as far as I know. I never really looked specifically if there is a minimum scale that helps. It's one of those things where it's very difficult to do any kind of modeling because you just don't have those scales well represented to begin with. And the in situ experiments so far tend to just go really fine. And I don't know of any paper that have specifically looked into that, but I could be wrong. The chemistry really matters. Like what you're using, I think matters even more than the size at this point. That's pretty much where we are in terms of understanding.
Thank you. The next is, I have a question from Kyungmin No, and it might be easier if they ask them, unmute and ask themselves. If they're still there. Kyungmin,
Oh, yep.
go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to know that how can we just separate this MCDR induced signals and climate variability? Usually we use the ocean only models and then just prescribing the atmosphere variabilities so that it cannot have some feedback. So, but in a real world, the climate variabilities can make some really different responses. So is there any kind of framework or approaches for separating this kind of climate variability from this MCDR induced responses, which are really important for the monitoring, reporting, and validation of the carbon credit?
So more than climate variability, which we are in a way considering, because for example, in our case, the climate variability of the 2017 is there. And in fact, we see very clearly the impact of an hurricane going through. One of the jumps that you see in the 1 kilometer case is because there was an hurricane. For example, if you look at the curve that is not exactly smooth, it's because there was an hurricane passing. The seaworthy simulations use 50 years, take 15 years, but they use JR 55. So they use a reanalysis with all of that. The real issue is that when you start taking down more CO2 from the atmosphere to do alkalinity enhancement, you are actually reducing the CO2 that you have immediately up the regions where you have your alkalinity, your dust, right? And so what really happens is that what we are seeing here, it's an upper limit of what you're actually getting, which at least in our model is really not a lot. Because in reality, the solubility part is going to decrease some. Okay, simply because your PCO2, so your CO2 at the exchange layer, it's being kept constant in those simulations. More or less what is in the observations that we're using to do this. But in reality, if you are modifying that and if you're taking it down, then you're also going to have less imbalance, right? Because you are, and so there is going to be less CO2 to be in the atmosphere that you in the immediate layer above the ocean that you cannot take. So that's a problem. For that, you need a couple models. The problem is that those models, so the simulations I've been showing you have been running for like 7 months and we haven't finished yet. So it's really excruciatingly painful and to run at that resolution, uncoupled with all the chemistry and the biology.
Thank you. Any other questions for Annalisa? If not, let's thank her again for a beautiful talk. And just as we are, this is the last talk of this academic year. We will resume in the fall with Justin Burton running the, who just left, will be the new seminar chair. Please feel free to send the GPC suggestions for talks. And please check back this summer for when we hopefully start posting new talks for the fall. Thanks everyone for coming. Have a great summer, and thanks especially to Annalisa for an absolutely wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.